Yeah, it is the. Oh, now it's on. Now it's on. Yeah.
Good morning.
Yes. Hello.
Good. Okay. Yes. All right. Then hello and good morning. Welcome to our panel on how to lead a non-toxic newsroom in and after a pandemic. We have three wonderful and very insightful speakers here today with us to talk about this issue. On the very left side, there's Antonia Götz. She's the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business Manager, which is the German subsidiary of the HBR. We have with us Anita Zelina. She's the Director Strategic Initiatives at the Craig Newmark J School at CUNY. And Nidal Salah Eldin, who was supposed to talk with us here on the panel. Unfortunately, she has some urgent family issues she needs to attend, so she's not here with us today. Yet we have been very lucky that Shazna Nessa was so generous to join us very spontaneously. Shazna, she's the global head of visuals at the Wall Street Journal and executive committee member of the Online News Association. And my name, I'm Astrid Meyer. I'm the editor-in-chief of XING. XING is the biggest business social network for German-speaking countries. We have 20 million users, and we focus on business and job-related conversations. You will also be able to join our conversation. Unfortunately, we cannot take questions because there are no mics because of the corona regulations, but I have put Post-its on both sides. So if you have questions, I would like to ask you just to write them down and then hand them to us at the end of the panel, and we will take your questions this way. And before we start here, I would like to give you some numbers about what we are talking about toxic workplaces. The numbers are quite staggering. By one estimate recently cited in the MIT Sloan Management Review, employee turnover triggered by a toxic culture cost US employers nearly $50 billion per year, $50 billion US dollars per year. And that was before the Great Resignation started with the pandemic. And what's more important, I think, and what's more serious is that toxic culture really makes people literally sick. So when employees experience injustice in the workplace, their odds of suffering major diseases, including coronary diseases, asthma, diabetes, and arthritis, so we're not even talking about mental health issues here, they increase by 35 percentage points up to 55%. Now, the big question is, how can we tell if a workplace is really toxic or if we are just merely experiencing some irritating behavior, which I think everybody has experienced during their work life. And so I tried to look a little bit up, what does psychology say, what do scientists say, and of course, where there's science, they always argue what's the right definition. But the MIT Sloan Review, they recently did a very in-depth survey. They talked to a lot of people, and they defined 5 toxic culture attributes, which they are disrespect, non-inclusive, unethical, cutthroat, and abusive behavior. And I'm going to repeat that. It's disrespect, non-inclusive, unethical, cutthroat, and abusive. And I would really like to ask you in the audience, if you think about your own work experience, who in this room would say that they have experienced at least one of these 5 attributes? Please raise your hands. Okay. I would like to say that I am shocked because it's almost everybody, but in fact I am not. And this leads me to my first question, which goes to you, Antonia. As the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business Review, you deal with lots of different industries, not only with the news industry. What's your experience? Is the news industry more toxic than others?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have toxic leadership and toxic behavior in any industry, because, I mean, the numbers show. And we have narcissists in leadership roles in any industry, especially in leadership roles. In media, I feel we have 2 factors which might amplify the problem. I don't have a study on that, it's just my personal feeling and my experience and what people tell me. So at first I think media attracts people who like to be seen, who like to be heard. So I wouldn't say all of them are narcissists, but you have a number of ego-centered people, and ego-centered persons, and sometimes you have more toxic behavior with this kind of personality type. And the second thing is, I feel many journalists just love their job. I had this really interesting conversation with Lucy Küng the other day, and she said journalism was and maybe is like a calling, like the church. People kind of have to do it. And I feel if you love your job that much, you put up with it because you just feel you can't leave. So I feel those two factors make the problem worse in journalism.
Which also made me think that we are trained to reflect the outer world. That's what we do, and then we put everything together, but we're not really trained to do the inner reflection work. And especially when it comes to leadership, it's 60%, I would say, it's about inner reflection and only 40% about outer reflection, and we aren't taught this in business schools. Anita, do you think we also need to think differently about how we educate journalists to become leaders?
I mean,
Test. One thing that I do think, and again, every industry has its issues, but I think one thing that is somehow specific to the media industry is the lack of commitment towards management development and leadership development. And I think it's pretty striking. I did an executive MBA a few years ago, and I was the class of 130 people, and I was the only person from media. Everyone else was from oil and gas and the car industry. Very interesting experience, by the way, to kind of reflect on your industry with the eyes of someone who has literally no idea about that industry. And we did some exercises, and one of them, where we kind of assessed our companies and our industries. And one of them was an assessment of capacity investment in research and development, as well as leadership development. So everyone else from all the other industries, shared numbers like, we're at like 12% R&D reinvestment and like 8% executive education and leadership development. And everyone kind of was throwing these numbers out, and I did the maths, and I'm like, well, I never get above like 0.1 or 0.21 or something like that. And it's not just the company I worked at the time, right? There is no big history of media organizations really in a structured way thinking about what leadership entails, what skills and what traits and what behaviors it entails. And I think what that means is that sometimes, people just happen to kind of fall up the ladder in a way. Like the best journalist kind of, just at some point becomes the manager or the editor-in-chief. And those people, without wanting to generalize, but those people often have big egos, and they grew up in a culture where the person shouting the loudest was the leader or was perceived as the leader. And I think that's something that the media industry has been perpetuating for a while.
Shazna, you have worked in a couple of industries. You have worked in tech, in academia, philanthropy. Why do you think is this the case? I mean, we don't have money to invest in HR and professional management?
So, funnily enough, I have worked in tech and academia and philanthropy, and I would say newsrooms are the least toxic places of all of those industries that I've worked in. But I don't want to generalize either, because every newsroom is different. Yeah. And also I've been in journalism for 2 decades now, so what happened 20 years ago is not necessarily what is happening today. I do think there's actually been a lot of really great training because of people like Anita and others who are teaching very basic things like collaboration. I mean, ultimately it's about culture. And I know we say collaboration a lot, it's a bit of a buzzword, but what does collaboration mean? It just means respecting one another. It means listening. So I think through a lot of digital journalism, there's no way we can succeed if we don't change those cultures, even just for the business to do the work. So I actually think that we have made some inroads, and I think that, I work right now at the Journal in New York. It's a big organization, it's distributed globally. I can't see around every corner of the newsroom. So much of it is about individuals. I think there was an old culture of shouting. I just don't understand that, this old newsroom culture where you shout to get things done. And you bring in a young journalist and they don't know how to do things, they don't know the process, so they get shouted at. I think some of that is dissipating now, thankfully, but I do think there's room still. And I just want to also point out that something that made me really happy was when Reed Hastings, who was the CEO of Netflix, said something along the lines of, we are not hiring any brilliant jerks. This idea of the genius who is worth tolerating because the team is too important. And it made me happy because it was a powerful man saying this, because as many of us women might say things like this, unfortunately, we're not really listened to, but I thought he did a great thing by saying that. And I think it's interesting to think about, for those of you who hire people or have people in your teams, like, who are the brilliant jerks in your teams, and are they worth it? So much of toxic behavior is on an individual level, I think. Some of it's systemic, of course, but so much of it is in an individual level.
I think you're totally right. So the industry, of course, has moved on, and there are lots of new things going on. And I would like, before we talk about the brilliant jerk dilemma, I would like to go a little bit deeper into what is actually going on right now, because you, Antonia, you just did a study on attrition in newsrooms. So what did you find out? Tell us, why are journalists leaving the workplace right now?
Yeah, I just finished my year at CUNY with Anita, which was a brilliant experience. I recommend it, the program in leadership and innovation. So I talked to journalists in Germany who left legacy media by their own accord, so they quit their jobs and they took a different path. And there were reasons for them and pain points. They shared many pain points, in fact. And one was that people experienced growing workloads. So I had people telling me they were working on a team which was cut from 60 persons to 20 people. I think many of us have experienced that. And then they had back pain, felt exhausted, drank alcohol during the day even. So there were many red flags, and leaders not kind of reacting to these flags. So that was a real problem. In fact, it was not only that the manager was not reacting in this case. This person I talked to, Frank, he was diagnosed with burnout and depression, and his manager, he was called in for a management meeting because he went to the doctor during working hours. So these are the kind of stories I heard. And the second problem was people really mistrust and appreciation, respect. So I wanted to sort of point out, often toxic behavior is linked to loud action, to people shouting, people yelling, people throwing things across the newsroom, which happened, I witnessed. But I feel often toxic behavior is hidden and easily overlooked. Because if you get an email when you were promised a job, and then you get an email and one-liner from the editor-in-chief, which was also in my study, saying, oh, we have no more use for you, goodbye. I feel that is toxic behavior. It's not very loud, but it's aggressive. And not looking out for your people, and not seeing these red flags when people get really exhausted and burned out, that is also toxic behavior, as I understand it.
Well, thank you very much for sharing these examples with us. So we talked about the problem. I think we all agree that it exists and that it's an issue in newsrooms, that not all newsrooms are well prepared, but we have to find a solution, right? So Anita, you are talking to so many newsrooms. What is your experience? What is the best maybe first step to take if you want to say, hey, let's tackle this issue, because otherwise probably we won't have talent in a couple of years from now?
I mean, like with many problem-solving exercises, I'd say a certain amount of realization that there is a problem is kind of the first step. I find it very hard, whether as an executive educator or as a manager or as a consultant. It's very hard if there is no realization in the rest of the management team, in the organization, that there is an issue. It's very hard to even kind of get started. So the first thing that I say is, how can you help/nudge organizations and boards and leadership teams to understand that there is an issue? Now, sadly, sometimes just saying this is the right thing to do and your employees don't feel well and are unhappy and unhealthy, sometimes, sadly, that should be enough, right? We all know it should be enough, but sometimes isn't enough to really take action. What are boards and management teams incentivized on? Usually the bottom line, usually revenue, usually kind of the business results. So one thing that is very effective is to kind of make that persuasion and kind of connect it to the bottom line. And sometimes what helps is to kind of show the media organization that they are losing the people they really have to keep if they want to be successful in the future. And one big difference that I feel like just kind of from me living between Europe and the US somehow is that the US, the Great Resignation is a way bigger thing in the US than it is in Europe yet. I think it will become a big thing in Europe as well. But what you can see now in the US is that even amazing jobs, well paid, it's very hard to get good folks just because it's such an employee market and not an employer's market. So things are really, really changing. And, as an organization, when you realize, oops, I don't have a product manager for 6 months, so this product is not going to grow. We're not going to get more subscriptions. We're not going to sell more ads or whatever. Suddenly it becomes very real. It gets away from that touchy-feely thing. So I think that is like a first step.
Can I just add something? Please.
Yes.
Just quickly, Anita, you were saying what you're seeing in the US, and also there's so much unionization that's happening right now. Not legacy newsrooms, they're already unionized, but the younger digital news organizations, the staff are coming together to unionize, and we're seeing that with Amazon as well and Starbucks. So it's definitely not just journalism, but this is the manifestation of that angst.
Antonia, do you think that the pandemic, it has been so stressful for all of us, do you think it has changed our conception about what one needs to endure at work in order to be successful?
Oh God, that's a tough question. Because I feel the pandemic has changed our behavior and our expectations in so many ways. So I'm with Anita. I do think the Great Resignation, we will have that problem in Germany as well. And Xing had a big study. When I talk to German journalists about it or German HR, they're still like, oh, nothing happened yet. So they don't feel the problem yet. But I think it's just all the people I talk to, they have different expectations now, how they want to live with their families, how they want to work. People don't want to work 60 hours anymore. And I feel like for us, it's becoming difficult because we still have to find candidates for positions like news desk, all the positions which sort of shout, you will have long hours, no private life. And it's just the expectation of the management is often, we are just this great company and we offer you this position. But people don't want that anymore. And so I feel we really have to change how we create jobs, because nobody wants to be the person working, 10 hours a day on the news desk, just pushing stuff out, which other people have written. So I think we need more different jobs which are more about purpose and motivation. You can do this kind of jobs, but not the whole day.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I think things are changing also in Europe. And as Antonia said, we did the study at Xing, and actually now the willingness to change jobs for Germans is higher than in the US. And this has never happened before because Germans are they like their safety. They need to have their money at the end of the month in their bank account. So this is really a huge paradigm in Germany that people say, okay, I don't care. And every fourth person is really thinking about changing their job. Shazna, we had dinner last night and you said that actually now where you work now, the journal, you feel like it's maybe one of the best workplaces where you have worked so far. So what is the journal doing differently? Why do you think this toxic culture has been resolved there or never happened?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I do think it's. I've been at the journal 5 years, and I have to admit I was really surprised when I joined. I had a lot of assumptions based on no facts, just assumptions going in, and it's a really lovely newsroom culture there. Having said that, it's an old organization, so there's a lot of legacy. But in the last few years since I've been there, I know that we created a new office called the Managing Editor's Office, and that the role of that office is that more of the people aspects are managed in the newsroom and not by human resources. because journalists are very unique. They have different needs. We also created a big training program. Every single day there are sessions, peer-to-peer learning. So one of my team might be talking about building a visualization in D3, and anybody in the newsroom can come and listen in. And I think things like that open up channels of transparency, channels that are more democratic. If everybody's invited, everybody can be at the table. I think also during the pandemic, we used that vehicle to have lots of conversations. When the George Floyd killing happened, for example, there was a lot of smaller conversations going on, and they were open to everybody. And I think things like that really helped. People felt heard. I do want to also stress that toxicity, of course, is not just top-down. It's peer-to-peer, and it's bottom-up. So I think that's an interesting thing to talk about. I don't have a ton of examples, but I do know, for example, during the pandemic, tools like Slack have been amazing because we've been able to create really transparent channels. But I think there's a flip side, too, where if you have that access to just be chatting all the time and you're unhappy, you can really accelerate that unhappiness and wind each other up because you just start getting obsessed in these channels. So while I think Slack has been great, I think it's also been a little bit damaging in some ways in how it's been used.
Can I briefly just build on what Jasna just said, the factor of HR? And I think one thing that the journal does differently than others from my perspective is you have a very kind of active HR and people development. So I think what I still see in many more traditional news organizations and many European ones is HR is not perceived as kind of an action, the actionable team leading the organization into the future, right? HR is often defined as kind of a service center. So HR often means there is your HR service partner, and if you take vacation, this is the person kind of, that signs the form or something like that. Now, obviously, that leaves a huge gap, right? Because if HR is not the place where the future of the newsroom and the future of how teams work and the future of work-life balance and so forth are designed for the organization, but also you don't have anyone in the newsroom who has the training and the skills to do that. Who's doing it? No one's doing it, and that obviously leaves the organization in a bad place. And I think the decision to move things like this into or adjacent to the newsroom or merge it more into the newsroom is a super interesting one, and I see that happening in more places right now.
I think too that, do I have to? No, I think too in HR, generally corporate HR, that's being transformed as well. It's not just bringing it into the newsroom. They're not even calling themselves HR anymore. There are new terms for it. They're breaking up into talent teams, DEI teams, culture teams. But that's a fascinating industry to watch because it's becoming increasingly not just about human resource management, but a much more holistic way of, you talk about it.
No, I was nodding, agreeing, yes, Jasna, that's true. No, because I feel I love the concept of psychological safety from Amy Edmondson, and I think many have heard about her, and if you haven't, read her books, really good. Because, I mean, when she started her studies, she found out I think her first study was in hospitals, and she was looking how many mistakes team made. And she was expecting that the best teams would make fewer mistakes, but it was the other way around. And then she started her studies and found out that was because these teams were talking about their mistakes. And I feel in Germany, this is just starting, this conversation about mistakes, about doing testing, trying, and I feel HR, or however you call the head of people, they're so important because there's so much change going on in the leadership, in the culture, and you need to train your leaders to sort of create this safe space.
By the way, HR, who wants to be a human resource? Now, when you think about it, it's like,
if we didn't have COVID, we will have it now, Anita. Very cuddling here. All of us. Yeah, I think you really have to be very intentional about, and as you just said, you don't do mistakes in journalism, right? So if you do a mistake, it's a big issue. You get sued. There's lots of consequences, and we're not really trained to just try out things and then learn from it. And you said something about nudging, and I read that, for example, big organizations, they really create safe spaces for employees where they can meet and really have conversations and exchange thoughts about, let's say, when there's bullying or something toxic going on, and then they can also discuss together methods how to address this. But what do you do if this doesn't exist in your company? Because I think that puts you in an awful place. You have to do something, or you feel you need to do something, but at the same time you are taking lots of risks. So how would you go about that? Shazna?
I mean, I think there are just some really interesting organizations popping up, a lot of non-profit membership organizations. So Anita and I are both on the board of the Online News Association, and that's a really, really great community that addresses this kind of thing, that's really been looking at its membership and holding sessions around mental health. We have programs around leadership, a very popular one called the Women's Leadership Accelerator. If you haven't heard of it, you should, and you're interested, it's a really great program, or Anita's program as well. So there's also, Anita, I'm sorry, this isn't just to promote my, Anita, but she's also running this new organization called the News Product Alliance, which so much of the conversation that's happening in that group is these types of issues. While it's about creating products, it's also the way to create products is what we talked about a little bit earlier, is about listening. You've got to listen to each other. Like, how are you going to serve your audience if you can't even listen to one another and be respectful of one another? So I think there are just, like, if your company isn't providing that for you, I think there are increasingly support centers that are popping up, certainly in the US, but you might have more ideas around stuff in Europe or elsewhere.
Antonia, Anita, you want?
So I think finding support networks, whether that's organizations, associations, trusted groups of collaborators, finding support networks in the organization that are kind of interdisciplinary and span various departments. I think it's so important. I would not have survived 3 years in this industry without support networks, because it feels very lonely. You would think that it already feels lonely if you're kind of entering an organization that's somehow toxic. It feels even lonelier if you come up in that organization and you're one of the bosses and you're trying to push for change. If you don't have kind of those relationships and those support networks, it's very, very hard. It's like very hard on your psychological health, and it's also very hard on your well-being. And you're also not going to have success in changing things if you don't build those alliances, whether they are inside or outside of the organization. So I just can totally second what Shazna said.
And maybe, I mean, that is something that has grown during the last year, this idea of speaking up and me being a voice. Because I have to say that often I was so shocked in that moment when something toxic happened. I was so irritated. I didn't speak up because I was totally puzzled. And then now I'm more prepared to speak up for me, for other people. And I mean, Slack or other channels are a good way to connect with other people in the room and ask, are you okay with that? Should I speak up? To find this connection while you are in the meeting, and maybe find other people who could help or be a group in this meeting.
Yeah, we also always had alliances, like when we knew, like some women in the newsroom, and we knew when we entered now the meeting, there will be some resistance, there will people like maybe not really in favor of our ideas. So what we always did is to discuss this before we went into the meeting and then really support each other, because I found that to be very helpful to really have these allyship. And what I would like to ask you is, of course, in the media, we talk a lot about allies and how the ones that are in power now, which mainly are white and male and older, how they need to become better allies. What do you think about this concept? And I would like to start with you, Anita.
Well, I think the one big and important thing that I learned and that I try to kind of remind myself of is that the weight of allyship has to be on us. on the white folks, and it has to be on men. It can't be on the women of color, on the people of color, on the people who come from more untraditional backgrounds. So it's our responsibility to change the organizations and change the networks we work in. And responsibility obviously goes from the big topics, right? What culture do you foster in your organization? But it starts with small things like saying no if you're invited to be on an all-male panel and you're a man. It means saying no to an all-white panel. It means saying no if you are or standing up if you are in a business meeting and you realize that someone is talking over someone else continuously, and someone who has the perceived higher power, usually white, male, more experienced, more connected in the organization, is continuously talking over someone. Say something, because this person the person being talked over is most likely in the weaker position. And those are things that don't necessarily, no one, keep in mind that the people who are privileged in that sense usually don't have to fear about their job. So speaking up it's not an excuse to say, well, it's uncomfortable. It should be uncomfortable, right? It should be uncomfortable for the person who committed it, but it's also fine if it's uncomfortable for you. So I kind of and I have to say that this is a learning journey, right? I feel like I'm nowhere where I would want to be when it comes to allyship. I constantly reflect on things that I do, and I think, oh, this was not perfect. I could have done that differently, or I could have spoken up louder, or I could have spoken up sooner or faster, or I could have kind of pushed for change. But as a general rule, I think the more powerful your position is, and the more powerful you are, and the higher you get in whatever hierarchy or network you're in, the bigger your responsibility to push for that change and to stand up for the people who can stand up for themselves.
Yeah, there's no change where it doesn't hurt, right? So there's no change in comfort. Do you want to add something to this? We have different thoughts.
I think when I was listening to you talk, it just took me back to something you said, Astrid, earlier, that so much of it is about our interior selves, less about hard skills that we learn, much more about self-awareness. So I saw recently, I got an email from my company that we've all been given an account to Headspace, which is a meditation app. And I actually think it's very, very healthy to meditate. And small things like that, just to be self-aware. I mean, I don't know what it's like in lots of other places in the world, but I do feel like there's an increasing acceptance of soft skills and that it's actually good for the business. I know that Google did a big study a few years ago called Project Aristotle, and they wanted to understand what makes a great team. And they spent quite a long time doing this, and then at the end of the day, it wasn't the team that had the most brilliant jerks on it, or even the most brilliant people. It was the group where everybody had an equal amount of time to speak. That's what made the best teams.
Which brings me to the brilliant jerks. Antonia, just a couple of months ago...
Thank you.
You did this one thing, no? Oh, you did a great work. You did a cover on the Harvard Business Manager, which was about narcissists. And you went very deep into this topic. There were lots of explanations, how people get there. And what was really surprising, to me at least, was that actually the amount of narcissists in top positions worldwide, they're not declining, they're increasing. So this topic gets even worse. So how do we get rid of the brilliant jerks?
That's a tough question. Yeah, I was surprised as well, especially the scientists found quite a big number of narcissism in new work surroundings. And there's a simple explanation. In new work surroundings, you often don't have formal structures, and then narcissists are just the people who take the power. So if you're like in the middle between something, in the middle between getting rid of all these hierarchical concepts and creating something new, so that is a gap where narcissists sort of grab the power. So you have to watch out for that in your organizations, I feel. And I think we can change a lot when we think about how do we choose people for our teams, and that's the job HR. I mean, there are lots of testing you can do. You can find out if people are motivated to work with other people, or if they are just more brilliant jerks who want to be seen. I did great workshop.
You have to be brilliant as well.
The brilliant team players.
No, you have to be really like amazing at what you do to be a brilliant jerk, right? Not just narcissistic. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Sorry.
No. So I feel so we can make a change when we change how we choose people. Like I got my job, I had 2 coffees, or maybe 3, just conversations, which was good for me, but I think you would have a better system when you make tests. Yeah, you would have more equality. And there are companies and other industries who just started these new protocols, and I think they're working quite well.
Yeah, so actually Xing does this, and I was really surprised when I went through the whole hiring process how well thought out that was. I had I think 5 or 6 meetings with peers, with my future team maybe, and then in the very end we even did a half-an-hour auditing with a psychologist, and I thought, oh my God, they must think that I'm really strange. But in the end, I thought it's so interesting because, as you said, in the news industry, you have coffee with someone, and then afterwards they offer you the job. So, and I know that you are very passionate about brilliant jerks. So, what is your idea? How can we get rid of them?
You've just got to fire them. You've got to give them an opportunity to change. You've got to tell them. You've got to be confrontational. I think everybody needs the opportunity to change if they want to. Yeah. Sometimes people don't know they're doing it. So tough conversations, and what's more important, the individual or the team? As a leader, if as a leader you have to make those decisions.
I mean, I just 100% agree, Shazna. I feel like societal change and organizational change usually happens in 2 directions, right? It happens with a certain push and a certain pull and a certain kind of, top-down decision-making paired with a bottom-up, grassroots movement. And it happens with a combination of orders and demands. And you need both, right? You need kind of that might sound like a big word, but you need kind of a movement of, we want to change things, and kind of, just kind of create that feeling that you want a new reality and you want to be part of a new reality. But you also need to make the management decisions. If you just kind of you see kind of the grassroots demand in your organization for kind of organizational change, but you don't fire the people who don't abide with it, then that's the opposite of accountability and respect, obviously. You cannot pretend to say, well, yes, we are all about the great work culture, but then actually know that the person on top, or one of the people on top, does not follow the rules. What signal does that send to the rest of the organization? Well, it sends the signal that you're not being true to what you promised. It sends the signal that you basically are on paper being accountable, on paper changing the organization, but in reality you're like, no, this person doesn't have to abide with it.
I mean, it's to me the definition almost of a toxic newsroom. It's like if you're tolerating individuals in that way, and everybody knows when somebody is not is being given different treatment. Everybody sees it.
Well, before we open up the discussion with you, I would like to take a look into the future. So what would be alternative KPIs to measure leadership success? Antonia, what do you think?
So I would like to be measured in how many people in my team I have developed, how many people can bring their strengths to work. That would be important KPIs to me.
I'm sort of mulling this right now, but I think that it would be interesting for everybody to have some of these leadership KPIs, even if you're not in a level of management or leadership. We're experimenting right now at Dow Jones with different ways of doing performance management, and there's some radical ideas too, like everybody can see everybody's end of year write-up, or that I don't write the review anymore, for example, for somebody. They write their own review, and then we have a conversation. So it's a lot more fluid, and it's not once every year. It should be a continuous conversation.
Not every incentive obviously is about money, but one approach for sure, and I still see many newsrooms where the incentive system, like the monetary incentive system, is not tied to performance reviews or 360 reviews or anything else. So you do them, they are kind of mandatory. You do the performance review, you do the 360, you do kind of that leadership reflection. But then it's like, but you're gonna, even if it's terrible, you're gonna get your bonus anyway because you kind of reached a KPI of like 7% growth in that and that metric. I mean, what signal does that send? It's like, in the really important things you succeeded, and that kind of touchy-feely, like, leadership thing. Yeah, we kind of do that because we have to, but it's not really that important. It doesn't, it's not connected to basically what you're earning and what you ultimately get as a bonus. So I think changing that and making this connection is actually also important.
Well, thank you very much so far. And I have seen that nobody picked up the post-its you did. Okay. So do you want just to bring us the questions and I will read them out? And I think if you still have questions, you can also just try and tell me the question. I will repeat it so that people on the stream can also hear it, and we will answer it anyway. So first question is, any advice for freelancers dealing with a toxic, probably workplace? And please write so I can read it. Editor. Okay, editor. As freelancers, you are often in a very imbalanced power relationship. Yeah, that's right. Do you have any thoughts?
I feel it's a tough situation because the power is so imbalanced. I mean, allyship, I think, is an important point and maybe something which could help. So is there anyone else on the team who could be an ally and try to find these persons and have a conversation with them? That would be a first idea. But I feel, this is the problem with toxic leadership. It's always like women, people of color, because there's this imbalance. For example, I had this friend in my study group. She was a Mexican and she didn't have a work visa, and she experienced lots of toxic leadership because they always came up to her and said, don't forget you're here on a work visa. So, that's so toxic, and if you have less power, that's a tough situation, and that's why allyship is so important. Yeah.
Do you have any? No. Okay.
Just maybe one thing again, but we visited that before, but this is even the less the smaller your kind of official power situation is in the organization, the more you're going to need the networks, the more you're going to need the outside networks. So more networking, more connections, more convenings, more finding your circles, more support systems. It's not going to help from today to tomorrow. And if the one editor you're dealing with is just like really, really, really bad, then you just probably want to say goodbye to freelancing for that organization.
Yeah, I do think talking about it widely with that's what I would add, and I'm just repeating what you said, but talking with other people who freelance for that organization, I think is really good as well, because the more you all are talking to one another, the less crazy you feel, and then word gets out. Word gets out that that's a bad organization to work for, and that's not great for the organization.
So I will try to read out the next question. Hi, what was the impact of the pandemic, lockdowns, home office, etc., on journalists' mental health in newsrooms and on toxic behavior? Has it increased or decreased? Do you have an example, maybe? Sorry, I know it's 3 questions in one.
It's okay. I don't have a study or anything of just what I experienced in the pandemic. It was stressful, and we experienced that in our organization. And Harvard Business Manager is linked to Spiegel and Manager magazine, so it's quite big. And we tried to offer help, but it was stressful. And I think the problem is kind of starting now. We have to help people to get through. And another way, for me, the pandemic was sort of a chance, because like I shared quite openly as a leader for my team how I was working. My kid was running up and down. I was always in the kid. I'm famous for working in the kids' room, just squeezed somewhere. And after a couple of weeks, I found out that was really good. And my team said, "Oh, it was so good that you shared how your situation was." So we felt safe to share our situation and our needs and our problems. So I feel if you're a leader in a team, share your struggle, share when you're weak, because that is a critical factor of psychological safety.
So maybe to add one thought to that, I think the difficulty about analyzing the past 2 years when it comes to work culture and the impact of those changes and all of that is there are many things that happened the past 2 years. One, a pandemic, not great. Two, suddenly we all worked remote. Not necessarily bad, right? Those two things are kind of intermingled in a very untangleable way, if that is a word. So it's what you see in a variety of studies and research is basically that realization the last 2 years are not how remote work would look if we wouldn't have had a pandemic. So I think what happened for many people I talk to in newsrooms is there was a perceived advantage in more flexibility, spending more time with your kids, being able to do what Antonia just said. But then obviously there was also, a perceived disadvantage, not just perceived, a disadvantage in, being in an extreme stress situation, living through the first pandemic we all lived through, and having organizations that weren't really sure how to kind of handle that, right? And kind of learning that together. So I think those two things are kind of combined, and it's hard to see, how do these kind of play out against each other. One study that I saw recently that I found very interesting is Microsoft did like a gigantic research, not focused on the media industry, but focused on all kinds of industries, where they found that all of us have way more meetings now than we did before. So I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's like 1 hour, 40 minutes more. They also said there is like a third peak. So there used to be kind of a productivity peak, an activity peak in meetings and so forth, and emails and so forth, sometime before noon, and then sometime before, like early afternoon, right after lunch. And now there is like a third peak. So a lot of people kind of work again at like 8:30, 9 p.m. Is that per se a bad thing? Well, it is if it kind of ends up being super stressful and more. But if you just choose to kind of leave the office at 4 or 3:30 and then say, well, I'm flexible now to do my work at night, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Mm-hmm. But I think it's going to be really interesting to see that when that research goes deeper and when we analyze what was actually good and what was bad and what is changing now that organizations are kind of forcing/gently persuading us to go back into the newsroom and into the office.
I mean, there have been several studies that found out that mental health globally has really gone very bad. Like people are really stressed out and depressed, and you might want to check the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. They did a study specifically on newsrooms, and I think, not surprisingly, in the newsroom, of course, mental health is also getting a bigger issue because it's doing globally in any industry. Are there any other questions left? If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Sorry, it's a fourth question.
Okay. Let me repeat the question for the live stream audience. So the question was, now that people go back to the newsrooms, are there studies measuring if they change their behavior so that there's more inner reflection because they had time to do so at home? I don't know, does any of you have read something about that?
I think basically it's too early. I mean, we are just starting to go back now. And but I feel, I mean, that's a big opportunity to really change habits. So what I'm discussing with my team is like, how do we want to create this hybrid workspace? I feel that if many people work from home, there's a need for like team meetings, day-long team meetings, to have these conversations. And I mean, I had lots of tough conversations during the pandemic about if people are vaccinated or not vaccinated, and to kind of moderate these personal issues. And I feel that's it's going to be a topic when we go back now.
One thing that is kind of adjacent to your question is, what's going to happen if all organizations are now like, okay, let's go back? I think one thing that's going to happen is that you'll see that that the cultural gap is going to open up, and I already see that right now. I'm not going to say it's a pure generational gap, because it's not all about age, but there is something about the generation as well. I know, I can tell you, and I'm not going to say names because they probably haven't said it, so, but I can tell you about 10 people I know who are kind of in the process of, who are basically ready to quit. They have their resignation letter right here if their organization says you have to go back 100%. Employers are not realizing that there is no before anymore, that this is a new reality. I spend way too much time on TikTok, personal revelation. But yes, TikTok is great. But why I bring it up is not just to share that with you, but also to say, if you are like me, not 20 anymore, but you want to see how 20-somethings think about work and the future of work and hybrid and remote, and what they think about bosses who tell them, oh, you have to go back. Yeah, it's great. We're going to be back 5 days, 38 hours. We're looking forward to that. Look at HR and Gen Z TikTok, and you'll see like we are running into a very interesting cultural kind of diversion here.
Okay, so I think the summary is more or less that we are just at the beginning of a huge change, and that we can all contribute to this change. And thank you very much for listening to us this morning. I hope you are leaving this panel more cheerful than you came in. And if not, there's no money we can give you back. Thank you.